Sherlock Holmes and the Three Ghosts of Christmas Eve. Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening, where stories unfold like mist across gaslit streets, where mysteries whisper rather than shout, and where the greatest adventures happen in the gentlest of ways. I am so glad you have found your way here tonight, to this place of soft shadows and flickering candlelight, where we might spend these next hours together in peaceful contemplation of things strange and wonderful. My hope for you tonight is simple, that as this tale unfolds, your thoughts might slow, your breathing might deepen, and sleep might find you as naturally as fog settles over the Thames on a winter's evening. There is no urgency here, no need to follow every word, only an invitation to let the story wash over you like warm bath water, carrying away the tensions of your day. Before we begin, I wonder, where has this night found you? In what corner of the world are you settling down to rest? But there is no need to answer aloud. Simply hold that thought like a small candle flame as we journey together. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling on London for 3 days without cessation, a persistent, gentle drumming that turned the cobblestones to mirrors and filled the air with that peculiar softness that only December rain can bring. It was the 23rd of December in the year 1891, and the city seemed to hold its breath between autumn's end and winter's true arrival. In the sitting room at 221 B. Baker Street, the fire burned with unusual intensity, as though Mrs. Hudson had determined that warmth, at least, should not be rationed during such relentlessly damp weather. The flames cast their amber light across familiar furnishings. The twin chairs positioned at careful angles to capture both fireside warmth and reading light. The overflowing bookshelves, whose volumes seemed to lean toward one another, like old friends sharing confidences. The Persian slipper hanging from the mantelpiece. And everywhere, scattered with that particular chaos that suggested method rather than disorder, the accumulated materials of a consulting detective's trade. Sherlock Holmes sat in his customary chair, long legs extended toward the fire, fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of profound contemplation that his companion had learned to recognize as the outward sign of intense mental activity. He had not moved for the better part of an hour, and the pipe that rested forgotten in the ashtray beside him had long since gone cold. Dr. John Watson, recently returned from his rounds despite the weather, occupied the opposite chair with a medical journal open upon his lap, though he had read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word, his attention drawn repeatedly to his friend's unusual stillness. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked away the moments with patient insistence, each small sound seeming amplified by the quietness of the room, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of rain against the windows. Outside, London prepared for Christmas with muted enthusiasm, the weather having dampened both streets and spirits. Yet there remained something expectant in the air, as though the city itself awaited some revelation, some breaking of the grey monotony that had settled over everything like a blanket. "You are troubled, Holmes," Watson ventured finally, his voice carefully modulated to match the room's peaceful atmosphere. He had learned over years of friendship when to speak and when to maintain companionable silence, and something in the quality of Holmes's stillness suggested that words might now be welcome. Holmes stirred slightly, his grey eyes focusing on his companion with that sudden intensity that could still, after all their time together, prove somewhat disconcerting. Troubled? No, Watson, merely contemplative. He reached for his pipe, discovered its cold state, and set it aside again with a gesture of mild resignation. Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual about the date? Watson glanced toward the calendar that hung near the door, more for form than necessity. The 23rd of December? Nothing beyond the obvious approach of Christmas, though I confess the weather hardly inspires festive sentiment. Precisely 3 years ago today, Holmes continued, his voice taking on that particular quality it assumed when he was speaking more to himself than to his audience. A most peculiar case came to my attention. It was never published, never added to your collection of sensational narratives, because it was never solved. The matter simply dissolved, like morning mist, leaving behind nothing but questions and the most profound sense of having glimpsed something that lay just beyond the boundaries of rational explanation. The fire popped softly, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney, and Watson found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn as always by the promise of mystery. I do not recall your mentioning such a case. I have thought of little else these past 3 Decembers, Holmes admitted, a rare confession of preoccupation. Each year, as the date approaches, I find myself reviewing the details, searching for the pattern I failed to perceive, the connection I did not make. It involved 3 individuals, Watson, each of whom claimed to have been visited by what they termed a ghost, each on successive Christmas Eves, each describing experiences so similar in their essential particulars, yet so different in their specific details, that the matter presented a puzzle of extraordinary complexity. Before Watson could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stairs drew both men's attention towards the door. Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread was followed by a lighter, less certain step, and presently their landlady appeared in the doorway, her round face bearing that expression of mingled concern and curiosity that Watson had come to associate with the arrival of new clients during unconventional hours. Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there is a gentleman to see you. I told him the hour was late and the weather dreadful, but he insists the matter cannot wait until morning. She lowered her voice, though the visitor remained presumably out of earshot on the landing. He seems quite agitated, sir, though he is making every effort to contain it. Holmes was already rising from his chair with that sudden animation that transformed him from statue to action in an instant. Show him in, Mrs. Hudson, by all means, and perhaps you might be so good as to bring tea, something warming for a traveller on such an evening. Already preparing it, Mr. Holmes, she replied, with a smile that suggested long familiarity with his habits, and withdrew to usher in their unexpected visitor. The man who entered the sitting room seemed to bring the weather with him, droplets of rain still clinging to his dark overcoat, his hat dripping steadily onto Mrs. Hudson's clean floor. He was perhaps 50 years of age, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, yet now distinctly unsettled, his eyes moving rapidly about the room, before settling on Holmes with an expression that mingled hope and something approaching desperation. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. His voice carried the educated accent of someone from university circles, though Watson detected beneath it a thread of his native Yorkshire. Forgive this intrusion at such an hour. My name is Edmund Blackwood, Professor of Medieval Studies at Cambridge. I have travelled directly from the university because I fear that if I wait even until tomorrow, it may be too late. Too late for what, precisely, Professor Blackwood? Holmes gestured toward the chair Watson had just vacated, himself perching on the arm of his own seat with that casual intensity he assumed when a case captured his interest. Please, sit. You are thoroughly soaked, and whatever has driven you through such weather to my door can surely be discussed in comfort. Watson, perhaps you might assist our guest with his coat. Before you fall asleep tonight, I wonder if you might share what hour has found you reading these words, and from what distant or nearby place you listen. As Blackwood settled into the chair, divested of his wet outer garments and cradling the cup of tea Mrs. Hudson promptly delivered, Watson noted the man's hands trembling slightly, whether from cold or emotion he could not immediately determine. The professor took a long sip of the warming liquid before speaking again, and when he did, his voice had steadied somewhat, though his eyes remained troubled. Mr. Holmes, I must beg your discretion in this matter above all things. What I am about to relate touches upon my professional reputation, my standing at the university, and matters of such delicate nature that I scarcely know how to begin. Then begin at the beginning, Holmes suggested with uncharacteristic gentleness, and let the story unfold as it will. I have found that the most tangled mysteries often unravel themselves once given voice. Professor Blackwood nodded slowly, his gaze turning toward the fire as though seeking in its depths the courage or clarity to proceed. When he spoke again, his words came more slowly, weighted with significance that seemed to press upon him like a physical burden. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter. It bore no return address, no signature, only a single sheet of paper, upon which was drawn a symbol I recognized immediately from my studies, a medieval cipher mark used by a secret scholarly society that supposedly disbanded in the 15th century. Accompanying this symbol was a date, December 24th, and an address here in London in Whitechapel, of all unlikely places. He withdrew from his inner pocket a carefully folded paper, which he extended toward Holmes with evident reluctance. I would have dismissed it as an academic prank, Mr. Holmes, except for one detail. The paper upon which this was written is genuine 15th century vellum. I know this with absolute certainty. I have handled enough medieval manuscripts to recognize authentic period materials, and this is undoubtedly genuine. Someone has used a 500-year-old piece of writing material to send me what amounts to an invitation, or perhaps a summons. Holmes took the paper with delicate fingers, holding it close to the firelight, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. Watson, observing from his position near the window, saw his friend's expression shift through several subtle gradations of interest, before settling into that look of fierce concentration that indicated a puzzle worthy of his attention. "Most intriguing," Holmes murmured. "And you say this symbol relates to a medieval society? Tell me everything you know of them." The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows as Professor Blackwood began to speak of ancient mysteries and scholarly secrets, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a lecturer, even as he described matters that clearly unsettled him profoundly. The fire burned lower, casting longer shadows across the room, and in those shadows one might almost imagine other listeners, other presences, drawn by the tale now unfolding in that cosy, lamplit space above Baker Street. Part 2. Professor Blackwood drew another steadying breath, his fingers tracing the rim of his teacup, as though the circular motion might order his thoughts. The firelight caught the steam rising from the cup, transforming it into ephemeral spirals that danced upward before dissolving into the warm air of the sitting room. Outside, the rain had shifted its rhythm, no longer the steady drumming of earlier, but a softer, more intermittent patter, as though the very weather were settling in to listen to the tale about to unfold. The society called themselves the Custodes Umbrarum, Blackwood began, his scholar's voice lending the Latin words their proper weight and pronunciation. The Keepers of Shadows. They emerged in the late 13th century, during a period of intense intellectual ferment, when scholars across Europe were rediscovering classical texts and pushing at the boundaries of accepted knowledge. But unlike other scholarly fraternities of that era, the Custodes were not interested in philosophy or natural science. Their obsession, Mr. Holmes, was with time itself. Holmes had moved to his chair properly now, his body arranged in that deceptively casual pose that Watson knew indicated complete attention. His long fingers were pressed together before his lips, his eyes fixed upon Blackwood with unwavering focus. Time, elaborate if you would, Professor. They believed, Blackwood continued, setting down his teacup with careful precision, that time was not the simple linear progression we experience, but rather something far more complex. A tapestry, they called it, in which past, present, and future were woven together in patterns that could be perceived by those who knew how to look. Their writings, the few fragments that survive, speak of moments when the fabric grew thin, when one might glimpse or even step between the threads. They were particularly interested in liminal times, twilight, midnight, the turning of seasons, and most especially, they focused on Christmas Eve. Watson found himself shifting in his seat, drawn, despite his rational medical training, into the atmosphere of mystery that was building in the room like a tangible presence. The clock ticked onward, marking moments that suddenly seemed less certain, less fixed than they had only minutes before. Christmas Eve, Holmes repeated thoughtfully, the boundary between sacred and secular time, between one year's end and another's beginning. Yes, I can see how minds inclined towards such theories might find significance there. But you said the society disbanded in the 15th century? Officially, yes. Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping, though there was no one to overhear save Holmes and Watson. In 1473, during the reign of Edward IV, the Society's main house in Oxford was raided by church authorities. The official records speak of heresy, of practices that bordered on necromancy. Though reading between the lines of those biased accounts, it seems their crime was more intellectual than spiritual. They were experimenting with something, attempting to prove their theories through some form of ritual or observation. Whatever they did, that Christmas Eve, it alarmed the authorities sufficiently that the society was forcibly dissolved, its members scattered, its documents seized and presumably destroyed. He paused, his hand moving almost unconsciously to his inner pocket, as though to reassure himself that the mysterious letter still resided there. Presumably destroyed. Yet, 200 years ago, a cache of their writings was discovered sealed within the walls of an abandoned monastery in Somerset. These documents, cryptic, fragmentary, maddeningly incomplete, form the basis of what little we know about the Custodes Umbrarum. I have spent 15 years studying those fragments, Mr. Holmes. They are my area of particular expertise, which is why this letter troubles me so profoundly. Holmes rose suddenly, crossing to his desk, where he retrieved a magnifying lens and returned to examine the vellum more closely. The firelight played across his sharp features as he studied the document, his brow furrowed in concentration. The symbol itself, describe its significance. It was their mark of gathering, Blackwood explained, watching Holmes's examination with evident anxiety. When the society wished to convene, members would receive a communication bearing that symbol. The meetings themselves were shrouded in secrecy, held at locations known only to the initiates. But here is what truly unsettles me, Mr. Holmes. According to the fragments I have studied, the custodes believed that on certain Christmas Eves, they called them threshold nights, the boundaries between times grew so thin that extraordinary things became possible. They developed elaborate calculations to predict these threshold nights, based on astronomical observations, historical patterns, numerological formulas. And according to their system, this coming Christmas Eve, tomorrow night, is one such threshold. The fire crackled sharply, breaking the spell of silence that had fallen over the room. Watson stirred, his practical nature asserting itself, despite the atmospheric pull of the narrative. Surely you cannot give credence to such medieval superstition, Professor. However fascinating as historical curiosity, these theories hardly constitute reason for alarm. Blackwood turned to face the doctor, and in his eyes was something that made Watson's skeptical words fade unspoken. Dr. Watson, I am a rational man. My entire career is built upon empirical scholarship, upon documentary evidence and verifiable facts. But 3 nights ago, I had a dream, or I believe it was a dream, though it possessed a vividness, a reality, that no dream I have ever experienced could match. I found myself standing in a room I had never seen before, circular, built of ancient stone, lit by candles whose flames burned in impossible colours. And in that room were 12 figures in medieval robes, their faces hidden by deep hoods. They stood around a table upon which lay objects I could not quite perceive, save that they seemed to shift and change as I looked upon them. And then one of the figures spoke, though their lips did not move, and the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and it said, "The threshold opens. The invitation is extended. Come to the place marked at the hour appointed, or the pattern will remain incomplete." He fell silent, his hands gripping the arms of the chair with white-knuckled intensity. I woke gasping, my heart racing, convinced it was merely a nightmare, born of too much late-night study. But when I lit my lamp, I found mud upon my bedroom floor, Mr. Holmes. Mud from no garden I recognized, with a peculiar reddish tint, and clutched in my hand was a small stone, carved with the same symbol that appears on that vellum. A stone I had never seen before, could not possibly have acquired in my sleep. Holmes had gone very still, the vellum forgotten in his hands, his entire attention now fixed upon their visitor. When he spoke, his voice carried a note Watson had rarely heard, genuine uncertainty wrapped in fascination. "You have this stone with you." Wordlessly, Blackwood reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a smooth, dark pebble, perhaps an inch in diameter. Even from across the room, Watson could see the symbol carved into its surface, and there was something about the stone itself that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the firelight, giving it an unsettling quality of depth, as though one might fall into its darkness and never find the bottom. Holmes took the stone carefully, turning it over in his long fingers, holding it to the light, even bringing it close to his nose, as though scent might reveal secrets invisible to the eye. For several long moments he examined it in silence, while the rain whispered against the windows, and the fire settled into glowing coals. Finally, he looked up, his expression grave. "This stone is old, Professor Blackwood. Very old indeed. The wear patterns suggest it has been handled by many people over a considerable period of time. The carving was done with tools and techniques consistent with medieval stonework. And unless I am very much mistaken, this is not British stone at all, but rather a type of basalt found primarily in volcanic regions of southern Italy. Specifically, if my rather specialized knowledge serves, near Monte Cassino, where one of medieval Europe's most influential monasteries once stood." Monte Cassino, Blackwood breathed. Yes, of course. The fragments mention that the custodies had contacts there, that some of their most important texts were preserved in that monastery's library before being brought to England in the 14th century. He stood abruptly, beginning to pace before the fire with agitated steps. "But do you understand what this means, Mr. Holmes? I cannot have acquired this stone through any rational means. I went to bed in my locked chambers at Cambridge, and I woke with physical evidence of something that cannot possibly have occurred. Either I am losing my mind, or something far stranger is at work." Watson cleared his throat, his medical instincts rising to offer comfort, even as his mind struggled with the implications. "Professor, might you have acquired the stone earlier, perhaps during your research, and simply forgotten? The mind can play curious tricks, especially when one is deeply immersed in study of such matters. The dream itself could have been triggered by the stress of receiving that letter, and in a semi-conscious state, you might have retrieved a forgotten specimen and... I appreciate your attempt at rational explanation, Doctor." Blackwood interrupted, not unkindly. "Indeed, I have told myself similar things these past 3 nights. But there is more. Yesterday, I received a visit from a colleague, Professor Margaret Thornbury, who teaches medieval history at University College London. She came to my rooms in a state of considerable distress, and when I asked what troubled her, she described receiving an identical letter to mine, complete with the same symbol on the same impossible vellum. And she, too, had experienced a dream, though hers differed in details while matching in essence. She saw the same circular chamber, heard the same voice, woke to find evidence that she had somehow physically been elsewhere while apparently asleep in her bed. Holmes had returned to his chair, but far from the languid contemplation of earlier, he now radiated focused energy, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and implications. Did she also receive a stone? No, but she found her nightdress damp with water that smelled of old stone and darkness, as though she had walked through some ancient underground place. And there was this. Blackwood drew from his pocket yet another item, a photograph in a small leather frame. She asked me to show this to you, if I indeed came to seek your help. She was too frightened to come herself. The photograph showed a woman of perhaps 45, with intelligent eyes and dark hair, arranged in the fashion of academic professionals who had little time for elaborate styling. But it was not the woman herself that drew attention. Behind her, barely visible in the shadowed background of what appeared to be a library, stood a figure, indistinct, blurred as though in motion, yet unmistakably there, a robed form that should not have been present when the photograph was taken. "This was taken 2 days ago," Blackwood said quietly, "by her assistant in her own private study, in full daylight. She insists no one else was present, yet there it is." The fire had burned very low now, and Mrs. Hudson's quiet knock announced her entry to tend it. As she coaxed the flames back to life, adding fresh coal with practiced efficiency, the renewed light seemed to push back shadows that had grown perhaps too comfortable in the room's corners. She glanced at the three men with the perceptive eye of one who had witnessed many strange consultations in this chamber, offering a slight smile of reassurance before withdrawing once more. Watson found his voice, though it emerged less steady than he might have wished. "Holmes, surely there must be some rational explanation. Photographic anomalies, coincidental dreams, even the vellum might be explained through less extraordinary means than what seems to be implied here." "Might be explained, yes," Holmes agreed, his eyes still fixed on the photograph. "But then, we must ask ourselves, Watson, does the simplest explanation truly account for all the facts? Or are we forcing evidence into familiar patterns because the alternative troubles us?" He looked up at Blackwood, and in his face was that expression Watson knew well. The look of a man confronting a puzzle that defied his considerable powers of deduction, while simultaneously delighting in the challenge. "Professor, you came here because you believe something impossible is occurring, and you hope I might either prove it rational or help you navigate its irrationality. Is that accurate?" "I came," Blackwood said slowly, "because tomorrow night I am expected at an address in Whitechapel, and I am terrified of what I might find there. Yet I am equally terrified of not going, of leaving this mystery unsolved, this invitation unanswered. I am a scholar, Mr. Holmes. The pursuit of knowledge is my life's work. But I confess I do not have the courage to face this alone." Holmes stood, crossing to the window, where he gazed out at rain-soaked Baker Street, his profile sharp against the darkness beyond. When he spoke, his voice carried that note of decision that Watson had heard before crucial undertakings. "Then you shall not face it alone, Professor Blackwood. Watson and I will accompany you to this address tomorrow evening. We shall see together what awaits at this threshold your medieval scholars believed was opening, and if it proves to be an elaborate hoax, we shall expose it. If it is something more—" He turned back, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Well, then we shall have a mystery worthy of Christmas Eve to occupy our faculties." Part 3. Morning arrived with reluctant grey light filtering through persistent clouds, the rain having finally ceased sometime in the small hours, leaving London washed clean and glistening under a sky that promised nothing more cheerful than continued gloom. Watson woke to find Holmes already dressed and standing at the sitting-room window, a cup of cold coffee forgotten in his hand, his gaze fixed upon the street below, with that distant quality that suggested his mind was far from Baker Street, pursuing threads of thought through labyrinths only he could perceive. "You have been awake all night," Watson observed, not as a question, but as simple statement of fact, crossing to the breakfast table where Mrs. Hudson had laid out their morning meal with her usual thoughtful efficiency. The scent of fresh bread and butter mingled with the lingering aroma of pipe tobacco, creating that particular combination of comfort that Watson had come to associate with mornings in these rooms. Sleep seemed an unnecessary luxury when there was so much to consider, Holmes replied, finally moving from the window to join his friend at the table, though he showed little interest in the food before him. "I have been reviewing everything I know of medieval scholarship. of temporal theories, both ancient and modern, of documented cases involving shared delusions or mass hallucinations. And I confess, Watson, I find myself unable to construct a satisfactory framework that accounts for all the peculiarities of Professor Blackwood's account. Watson buttered his toast with deliberate attention, his medical training asserting itself even as his imagination threatened to run toward less rational explanations. The stone troubles me most. If Blackwood truly acquired it during some form of unconscious wandering, we are dealing with a case of somnambulism of remarkable complexity. Yet, he shows no other signs of such a condition, and the specificity of the dream experience argues against simple sleepwalking. Precisely, Holmes agreed, finally taking a piece of toast, though he merely held it rather than eating. And then there is Professor Thornbury's photograph. I have sent young Wiggins to collect it for more thorough examination. If it proves to be a genuine anomaly rather than a photographic defect or deliberate manipulation, we enter territory that my methods are poorly equipped to navigate. The morning passed in quiet preparation and research. Holmes spent hours in his reference volumes, pulling down texts on medieval history, temporal philosophy, and the documented activities of secret societies throughout European history. Watson attended to his correspondence and medical journals, though he found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the circular chamber Blackwood had described, to robed figures and impossibly coloured flames, to the notion that time itself might be less fixed than common experience suggested. At 2:30, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Professor Margaret Thornbury herself, accompanied by a younger man, whom she introduced as Dr. Richard Ashford, a lecturer in physics at King's College. Thornbury was much as her photograph suggested, a woman of sharp intelligence and no-nonsense demeanour, though Watson noted the shadows beneath her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands as she removed her gloves. Dr. Ashford, by contrast, appeared almost offensively healthy and cheerful, his boyish face animated with an enthusiasm that seemed at odds with the gravity of their situation. "Forgive my insistence on coming, Mr. Holmes," Thornbury said, as she settled into the chair Holmes offered her. "Edmund told me of your agreement to investigate this matter, and I could not bear to wait idly while others pursued answers I desperately need. The dreams have continued, you see, every night since the first, and each time they grow more vivid, more insistent. You are most welcome, Professor Thornbury," Holmes assured her. "Indeed, I hoped you might visit, as there are questions only you can answer. But first, introduce us properly to your companion. Dr. Ashford, is it? Your presence suggests Professor Thornbury has confided in you regarding these unusual events." Ashford nodded eagerly, settling onto the edge of his seat with barely contained energy. "She has, Mr. Holmes, and I must confess the matter fascinates me enormously. You see, my particular area of research concerns the nature of time, as understood through modern physics. The work being done by men like Lawrence and others suggests that time may be far more flexible, more relative than Newton imagined. When Margaret, that is, Professor Thornbury, described her experiences, I immediately recognized parallels to certain theoretical frameworks that are only now beginning to be explored mathematically. Watson found himself warming to the young physicist, despite his initial skepticism. There was something refreshing about Ashford's open enthusiasm, his willingness to consider extraordinary possibilities without abandoning intellectual rigor. "You believe there may be a scientific explanation for what these scholars are experiencing?" I believe, Ashford said carefully, that what we call supernatural may simply be natural phenomena we do not yet understand. If time truly is more complex than our everyday experience suggests, and the mathematics increasingly indicate it is, then perhaps these medieval scholars stumbled upon some genuine insight, however cloaked in mystical language. The notion of thin places in time, moments when past and future press close to the present, is not incompatible with certain interpretations of emerging physical theories. Holmes had been listening with close attention, his fingers steepled before him. A fascinating perspective, Dr. Ashford. Yet, we must still account for the physical evidence, the vellum, the stone, the photograph. Even if we accept that time might behave in unexpected ways, we are left with tangible objects that appear to have crossed from elsewhere into our present reality. That suggests something beyond mere temporal perception. Unless, Thornbury interjected softly, the objects were always here, and it is our awareness of them that has shifted. Perhaps the custodes umbrarum left behind not just documents, but artifacts, carefully hidden, and whatever is occurring now is causing us to remember. No, that is not quite right. To resonate with them, perhaps, in some way that allows us to locate what was always present but previously inaccessible. The fire crackled thoughtfully, and for a moment the room fell into contemplative silence, each person pursuing their own line of reasoning through the maze of possibilities. Outside, London proceeded with its usual Christmas Eve preparations, vendors calling their wares, carriages clattering past, children's voices raised in excitement despite the grey weather. The contrast between the ordinary world beyond the windows and the extraordinary conversation within created a curious doubling effect, as though Baker Street itself existed in two times simultaneously. Watson broke the silence with a practical question. Professor Thornbury, you mentioned the dreams continue. Have they revealed anything new? Any details that might help us understand what we are walking into tonight? She hesitated, her hands folding tightly in her lap. The chamber remains the same, but I have begun to perceive more of its details. There are inscriptions on the walls, carved into the stone, though I cannot quite read them. They shift and blur whenever I try to focus upon them, and the objects on the central table have become clearer. There is a book, very old, its pages seeming to turn of their own accord. A glass vessel containing liquid that moves in defiance of gravity, flowing upward rather than settling. And three objects that I believe are meant for us, for Edmund, myself, and one other who has not yet revealed themselves. 3 objects for 3 people, Holmes mused. Yet the letter was sent to both you and Blackwood. Who is the third? I have been wondering the same, Thornbury admitted. In my most recent dream, one of the robed figures pointed toward an empty space in the circle, as though indicating where this third person should stand, and I had the strongest impression that they were already coming, already drawn by the same forces that pulled Edmund and me into this mystery, though they may not yet realize it. As if summoned by these words, the sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs drew all attention toward the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared, slightly out of breath, her usually composed features showing surprise. Mr. Holmes, there is a young woman here, most insistent. She says it concerns the matter of the medieval society, and that she has travelled from Edinburgh overnight. She appears quite distressed, sir. Holmes was already on his feet. Show her in immediately, Mrs. Hudson. The woman who entered was perhaps 30 years of age, dressed in travelling clothes that showed signs of hasty packing and long journey. Her hair, dark and abundant, had partially escaped its pins, and her face bore the exhaustion of sleepless nights and anxious travel. Yet her eyes, when they swept the room and settled upon the assembled company, showed intelligence and determination alongside the evident fear. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Her voice carried the soft burr of Scottish Highlands beneath educated diction. "I am Dr. Catherine MacDonald, lecturer in Celtic mythology at the University of Edinburgh. I received your telegram this morning and came at once, though I confess I do not understand how you knew to contact me when I have told no one of my experiences these past 4 nights." A profound silence filled the room. Watson looked to Holmes, whose expression had shifted into something between surprise and dawning comprehension. "Dr. MacDonald, I sent no telegram. I was unaware of your existence until this moment." The colour drained from MacDonald's already pale face. She swayed slightly, and Watson moved quickly to guide her to a chair, his physician's instincts taking precedence over the mystery. As she sank into the seat, she drew from her travelling bag a folded paper, which she extended toward Holmes with a shaking hand. The telegram was written on standard form, bearing that morning's date and the address of the Edinburgh Telegraph Office. Its message was brief and written in what appeared to be Holmes's characteristic terse style. "Your presence required Baker Street. Stop medieval society. Matter, stop. Come at once. Stop Holmes." "I did not send this," Holmes said quietly, examining the paper with intense focus. "Yet someone knew to use my name, knew you would respond, and knew that you belonged with us in this investigation." He looked up at the assembled group, and Watson saw in his friend's face something he had rarely witnessed: genuine unease mixed with intellectual excitement. "It would seem, ladies and gentlemen, that we are not the only actors in this drama. Someone, or something, is orchestrating events, gathering the players for whatever is to unfold tonight in Whitechapel." MacDonald had recovered somewhat, accepting the cup of tea Watson pressed into her hands. "The dreams," she said softly. "You have all experienced them as well. The circular chamber, the robed figures, the voice that speaks without words." "We have," Thornbury confirmed, leaning forward. "And you mentioned Celtic mythology. Have you encountered references to the Custodes Umbrarum in your research?" "Not by that name," MacDonald replied, "but there are Scottish legends of scholars who sought to breach the boundaries between times, particularly at the turning of the year. My own specialty is the mythology of thresholds and liminal spaces, the folklore of doorways between worlds. When I received the first dream 4 nights ago, I initially dismissed it as my subconscious processing research materials. But then I found this." She drew from her bag an object wrapped in cloth, which she carefully unfolded to reveal a small silver mirror, its surface darkened with age, its frame decorated with intricate Celtic knotwork. "This was lying on my pillow when I woke from the second dream. I live alone, Mr. Holmes. My rooms were locked from the inside. There is no rational way this object could have appeared, yet here it is, and when I look into it—" She trailed off, her hand hovering over the mirror's surface without quite touching it. Holmes reached out carefully. "May I?" At her nod, he lifted the mirror and held it to the light. For several long moments he gazed into its depths, his expression shifting through subtle gradations that Watson had learned to read. Curiosity giving way to surprise, then to something approaching wonder. Finally, he turned the mirror so the others might see. The reflection should have shown the ceiling of the Baker Street sitting room, angled as Holmes held the mirror. Instead, the surface displayed something else entirely. A circular chamber built of ancient stone, lit by candles whose flames burned in shades of blue and green and violet, exactly as Blackwood had described. And around a central table stood 12 robed figures, their faces hidden, their postures expectant, as though waiting for something or someone to arrive. Impossible, Watson breathed, yet the evidence hung before his eyes, undeniable and utterly inexplicable. Part 4. Holmes set the mirror face down upon the table with movements far more careful than his usual decisive handling of evidence, as though the object itself required a delicacy born not of fragility, but of profound respect for its inexplicable nature. The room seemed to hold its breath, that particular quality of silence that follows revelation, when minds struggle to accommodate what they have witnessed against everything they believed possible. The fire burned steadily. The clock continued its patient measurement of moments, yet something fundamental had shifted in the sitting room at Baker Street. Some boundary crossed that could not be uncrossed. Dr. MacDonald broke the silence, her voice carrying the steadiness of one who has moved beyond initial shock into grim acceptance. I have looked into that mirror a dozen times since it appeared, and each time I see the same chamber, though the figures sometimes move, sometimes gesture, as though in conversation I cannot hear. Once, one of them turned directly toward the mirror's surface, as though they could see me observing them, and I had the most unsettling sensation of being observed in return, of being assessed and found. Suitable, I suppose, though for what purpose remains obscure. Ashford had moved to examine the mirror more closely without touching it, his scientific curiosity evidently overcoming any hesitation. Remarkable. If this is some form of optical illusion or trick photography embedded in the glass itself, it surpasses anything I have encountered in my studies of light and reflection. The images possess depth and dimensionality inconsistent with any reflective surface I know. He glanced at Holmes. May I attempt a small experiment? At Holmes's nod, the young physicist produced a small notebook from his pocket and held it before the mirror at various angles. In each case, the mirror stubbornly refused to show the notebook's reflection, displaying instead only that unchanging view of the candlelit chamber. Extraordinary, Ashford murmured. The mirror is not reflecting light from our reality at all. It is showing us something else entirely, as though it serves as a window rather than a reflective surface. A window implies we might pass through, Thornbury said quietly, and Watson noticed her hand had moved unconsciously to her throat. A gesture of protection, or perhaps restraint. Is that what is expected of us tonight? That we somehow enter that place the mirror shows? Holmes had been pacing slowly before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind clearly working through possibilities with that methodical intensity Watson knew so well. Let us consider what we know with certainty, separating it from speculation and theory. We have 3 scholars, now 4, including Dr. Ashford, who have received communications regarding a gathering tonight at an address in Whitechapel. These communications arrived via demonstrably impossible means. Genuine medieval vellum, objects appearing in locked rooms, a telegram I did not send. Each of the 3 primary recipients has experienced remarkably consistent dreams of a circular chamber and robed figures. And we possess 3 physical objects that defy rational explanation: a stone, a photograph, and a mirror, each connected to one of you. He paused in his pacing, turning to face the assembled group. The pattern suggests deliberate selection, careful orchestration by intelligence, rather than random supernatural occurrence. Someone or something has chosen you 3 specifically. The question we must answer before venturing to Whitechapel is this: why you? What connects 3 scholars from different universities, different specialties, different corners of Britain? A thoughtful silence followed his question, broken only by the soft settling of coals in the fireplace. It was Thornbury who spoke first, her academic training evident in the careful way she assembled her thoughts. Our specialties, while different in focus, share a common thread. I study medieval history with particular emphasis on secret scholarly societies. Edmund's work concerns the Custodes Umbrarum directly. Catherine researches liminal spaces and threshold mythology. And Richard brings modern physics to bear on questions of temporal flexibility. We are all, in our various ways, concerned with boundaries, between times, between worlds, between what is known and what is mysterious. More than that, Blackwood added, leaning forward with growing excitement, I have been thinking about this since Catherine arrived. 15 years ago, when the Somerset documents were first discovered and made available for scholarly study, there was a small conference held to examine them. I attended as a young graduate student, barely beginning my career. Margaret, you presented a paper there on medieval secrecy and knowledge transmission. Thornbury's eyes widened with recognition. Yes, I remember. And you asked a question during my presentation about whether the Custodes might have preserved their knowledge through hidden artifacts rather than solely through texts. She turned to MacDonald. Were you there as well? I was. MacDonald confirmed slowly, her voice filled with dawning realization. Though I attended only briefly, as my research focus was still forming, I remember thinking the documents were fascinating, but feeling they fell outside my area of expertise. I left after the first day. She paused, her brow furrowing. But there was something else. A strange man who attended none of the official sessions, but who stood in the corridor during breaks, watching the attendees. He wore old-fashioned clothing, even for 15 years ago, and he carried a leather satchel that looked positively ancient. I noticed him particularly because he seemed to be studying certain participants with great intensity, and I recall thinking he was watching you, Professor Blackwood, with a special interest. The room had grown colder, or perhaps it merely seemed so, as the implications of this connection settled over them like winter fog. Watson rose to add more coal to the fire, grateful for the simple physical task that allowed his mind a moment to process what he was hearing. 15 years ago, these 3 scholars had been in the same place, studying documents related to the very society that now seemed to be reaching across centuries to make contact. The man in the corridor, Holmes said urgently. Describe him in as much detail as you can recall. MacDonald closed her eyes, clearly reaching back through memory. Tall, very thin, with a scholar's stoop, as though from long hours bent over books. His hair was grey, worn longer than current fashion, and he had the most remarkable eyes, pale grey, almost colourless, and they seemed to look through you rather than at you. His hands were unusually long-fingered, and I remember noticing they were stained with ink, as though he spent much time writing. He never spoke, at least not that I heard, but he gave an impression of great age despite a face that was relatively unlined. I saw him too, Blackwood said suddenly. Not at the conference itself, but afterward. I had stayed late in the library where the documents were kept, making notes, and when I finally emerged well past midnight, he was standing in the quadrangle below, looking up at the library windows. He was so still he might have been carved from stone, and when I descended to the courtyard, he had vanished completely. I thought at the time I had imagined him, a phantom born of exhaustion and too much medieval mysticism. Holmes had gone very still, that particular stillness that overtook him when pieces of a puzzle were beginning to align in his mind. This man appears at a conference 15 years ago, takes particular interest in 3 young scholars studying documents related to the Custodes Umbrarum, and vanishes without trace. Now, 15 years later, those same scholars are contacted through impossible means and drawn into a mystery centered on the very society they had studied. The timing cannot be coincidental. But what does it mean? Watson asked, voicing the question they all were thinking. If this man somehow marked them 15 years ago, if he has been planning this gathering for all that time, what could possibly be his purpose? Ashford, who had been silent for some minutes, spoke up with the tentative tone of one offering a theory he himself finds incredible. In physics, when we observe certain phenomena, we affect the outcome of the observation itself. The act of measurement changes what is being measured. Perhaps by studying the Custodes documents, by focusing scholarly attention and intellectual energy on these questions of temporal boundaries, these 3 individuals somehow activated something, made themselves visible to forces or intelligences that operate according to principles we do not understand. You are suggesting we are dealing with something that responds to thought, to focused attention. Thornbury's voice carried both skepticism and reluctant consideration. That borders dangerously close to theosophy and spiritualism, Dr. Ashford. Perhaps, he acknowledged, or perhaps what we call consciousness and what we call physical reality are not as separate as we have assumed. Quantum mechanics is beginning to suggest that observation and reality are intertwined in ways that would have seemed like pure mysticism to previous generations of scientists. If time itself is more flexible than Newton believed, why should consciousness not also operate according to principles we have yet to discover? The afternoon had deepened toward evening while they talked, the winter darkness coming early as it did in December, and Mrs. Hudson appeared to light the lamps, casting warm pools of light throughout the sitting room that made the shadows beyond seem all the deeper. She brought fresh tea and small cakes, simple kindnesses that anchored them to the ordinary world, even as they discussed matters that threatened to unmoor reason itself. As they took refreshment, Watson found himself studying his companions with the diagnostic eye he brought to medical examination. Blackwood showed signs of chronic sleep deprivation, the tremor in his hands suggesting sustained anxiety. Thornbury maintained better composure, but her frequent glances toward the face-down mirror revealed preoccupation bordering on obsession. MacDonald displayed the robust health of someone accustomed to highland walking and outdoor pursuits, yet her eyes held a wariness that spoke of deeply shaken worldview. And young Ashford vibrated with barely contained excitement, the enthusiasm of intellect encountering genuinely novel phenomena outweighing any fear of the unknown. Holmes, Watson noted, showed that peculiar animation that overtook him when confronted with a truly worthy puzzle, the signs of cocaine's lure held at bay by genuine fascination. His friend was in his element, and Watson felt the familiar mixture of concern and admiration that characterized his feelings toward Holmes's more extreme intellectual pursuits. "The address in Whitechapel," Holmes said, returning them to practical matters. "Professor Blackwood, you have it still?" Blackwood produced the vellum once more, pointing to the notation below the symbol. "Number 17, Shadwell Court. I confess I looked for it on maps of London and found nothing by that name. The street may no longer exist, renamed in the decades since the area was developed." Or, Holmes suggested, his eyes glinting with that particular light that indicated a deduction forming, "it may never have existed in common knowledge at all." Whitechapel has many courts and alleys that appear on no official maps, spaces that exist in the cracks between recognized streets, known only to locals and those with reason to seek them out. If the Custodes Umbrarum wished to maintain a presence in London while avoiding official notice, such a location would serve admirably. He crossed to his desk, pulling out detailed maps of East London, which he spread across the table, pushing aside teacups and the various artifacts of their investigation. His long fingers traced streets and alleys with practiced ease, moving through the labyrinth of Whitechapel's geography, with the certainty of one who had walked those streets many times in pursuit of various cases. "Here," he said finally, his finger coming to rest on a spot where several small alleys converged near the river. "This area shows irregular space on the map, gaps between the drawn streets that suggest the presence of courts or passages too small or insignificant to merit official notation. If Shadwell Court exists, it would be somewhere in this tangle of alleys just north of the Thames docks." "When do we leave?" Watson asked, though he already knew the answer. Holmes consulted his pocket watch. "It is now 5:30. The letter specified midnight on Christmas Eve. I suggest we dine here. Mrs. Hudson has undoubtedly prepared something substantial, anticipating our needs, and depart for Whitechapel at 11 o'clock. That gives us time to locate this mysterious court while ensuring we arrive neither too early nor too late for whatever awaits us." Part 5. The meal Mrs. Hudson provided was indeed substantial, a hearty fare of roasted chicken and winter vegetables that seemed calculated to fortify them for whatever the night might bring. Yet, despite the excellence of the food, Watson noticed that appetites around the table were modest at best, each person picking at their plate with the distraction of those whose minds are engaged elsewhere. The conversation during dinner remained deliberately light, a tacit agreement to speak of ordinary matters, as though by discussing the weather and recent theatrical productions, they might maintain some connection to the everyday world before venturing into whatever strangeness awaited them in Whitechapel's shadowed alleys. After dinner, they gathered once more in the sitting room, and Holmes produced from his desk drawer several items he had apparently prepared during the afternoon, while the others were occupied with their discussions. To each person, he distributed a small electric torch of the most modern design, compact yet powerful, along with a whistle that might summon assistance should they become separated in the maze of East London streets. "I do not know what we will encounter tonight," Holmes said as he distributed these items, "but I believe in preparing for practical difficulties even when facing impractical mysteries. Keep together, maintain awareness of your surroundings, and if at any point you wish to withdraw from this investigation, say so without hesitation or embarrassment. There is no shame in acknowledging when a situation exceeds one's comfort, and I would rather proceed with willing companions than reluctant ones. I have come too far to turn back now, MacDonald said firmly, tucking her torch into her coat pocket. 4 nights of dreams, a journey from Edinburgh, and the chance to potentially witness something that touches on every question my research has pursued for a decade. Whatever waits in Whitechapel, I must see it through. Thornbury and Blackwood murmured similar sentiments, and even Ashford, whose enthusiasm had dimmed slightly as the appointed hour drew nearer, nodded his agreement. Watson, for his part, checked the service revolver he had quietly retrieved from his desk drawer, ensuring it was properly loaded before tucking it into his coat. Holmes observed this with a slight smile, but said nothing, his own preparations having included a heavy walking stick that Watson suspected concealed more than decorative metal in its weighted head. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 10, and the sound seemed to resonate with unusual clarity, each note hanging in the air longer than natural. Outside, London had grown quiet with that particular hush that settles over the city on Christmas Eve, when even the most bustling streets empty as families gather by their fires, and the world pauses in anticipation of the holiday. It was into this unusual stillness that they would venture, 6 people drawn together by inexplicable circumstances, seeking answers to questions that defied rational inquiry. At 11:15, they began their preparations for departure. Coats were donned, scarves wrapped against the December cold, hats settled firmly against the wind that had risen as night deepened. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a worried expression to see them off, pressing a wrapped package into Holmes's hands with the quiet instruction to have something warm if you are to be out all night in such weather. Her eyes moved from face to face, reading in each the tension and anticipation that marked this as no ordinary evening's excursion, and Watson saw her make a small gesture that might have been a blessing, or simply a wish for their safe return. The streets of London unfolded before them in gaslit glory as they made their way eastward, Holmes having secured a large carriage that could accommodate all 6 passengers comfortably. The driver, a stolid man who asked no questions about their unusual destination or late hour, guided his horses through streets that grew progressively narrower and darker as they left the respectable neighbourhoods behind and entered the labyrinthine complexity of Whitechapel. Watson had been to this part of London before, most notably during the terrible autumn of the Whitechapel murders 3 years prior, and the memory of those dark days seemed to linger in the very stones of the buildings they passed. Yet tonight, the area wore a different character, emptied of its usual teeming life, the public houses closed or closing, the street vendors packed away, even the unfortunate women who usually haunted these corners, having retreated to whatever shelter they could find on Christmas Eve. The carriage halted at the edge of the area Holmes had identified on his maps, the driver clearly reluctant to venture further into the tangle of alleys ahead. They disembarked into a narrow street where the gas lamps cast more shadow than light, and where the buildings seemed to lean inward as though listening to conversations below. The wind carried smells from the river, salt and mud, and the indefinable scent of deep water, along with smoke from countless chimneys and something else, something older and less easily named. Holmes oriented himself with quick certainty, consulting a small compass and referring to the map he had committed to memory. This way, said quietly, his voice seeming to carry despite its low volume. "Stay close and watch your footing. These alleys are treacherous, even in daylight." They proceeded in single file, Holmes leading with Watson close behind, followed by Blackwood, Thornbury, MacDonald, and Ashford bringing up the rear. The alleys twisted and turned with no apparent logic, branching and rejoining in patterns that seemed designed to confuse rather than guide. Watson found himself grateful for Holmes's unerring sense of direction, his own mental map having dissolved after the third or fourth turning. The buildings here were ancient, some dating back centuries, their upper stories overhanging the streets so completely that in places the sky was reduced to a narrow ribbon of darkness above. Windows were few and mostly shuttered, though occasionally a gleam of candlelight suggested inhabitants within, families celebrating the holiday while strangers passed unknowing below. The cobblestones beneath their feet were uneven and slick with moisture, requiring careful attention to avoid stumbling. They had been walking for perhaps 15 minutes when Holmes stopped suddenly, his hand raised for silence. The group clustered close, and in the stillness, Watson became aware of a sound that had been growing gradually louder as they progressed deeper into the maze of alleys. It was a humming, low and resonant, as though the very stones around them were vibrating at a frequency just barely perceptible to human ears. The sound raised the hair on the back of Watson's neck, some primitive part of his brain recognizing it as fundamentally other, as something that should not be heard in the everyday world. "Do you all hear that?" Holmes asked quietly, and received murmured confirmations from each member of their party. "Good. It suggests we are approaching our destination. Professor Blackwood, does anything about this area seem familiar from your dreams?" Blackwood moved forward to stand beside Holmes, peering into the darkness ahead where the alley appeared to dead end against a brick wall. "The dreams never showed me the approach, only the chamber itself. Yet I feel..." He paused, struggling to articulate something beyond words. "I feel as though I have been here before, as though my feet know this path, even if my conscious mind does not recognize it." MacDonald had produced her silver mirror, holding it carefully as though it might bite. "Should we look?" she asked, her voice steady despite evident apprehension. "Perhaps it might show us what lies ahead." Holmes considered this for a moment before nodding, but carefully, and be prepared for whatever it may reveal. MacDonald raised the mirror, angling it to catch what little light filtered down from the distant gas lamps. For a moment, it showed nothing but darkness, and Watson felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment. Then, gradually, an image began to form in the tarnished silver surface. It was the same circular chamber they had seen before, but now the perspective had shifted, as though the unseen observer had moved closer to the central table. The robed figures remained in their positions around the room's perimeter, but now Watson could see that the table held more than he had previously perceived. The book MacDonald had mentioned lay open, its pages covered in script that seemed to shift and change even as they watched, words forming and reforming in languages both familiar and utterly alien. Beside it, the glass vessel pulsed with liquid that moved in impossible spirals, climbing the interior walls of its container in defiance of gravity. And arranged in a precise triangle around these items were 3 empty spaces, clearly waiting for the objects that each scholar carried: the stone, the photograph in its frame, and the mirror itself. It is a ritual, Ashford breathed, his scientific detachment cracking to reveal genuine awe. Or perhaps more accurately, a mechanism. Each object is a component in something larger, and we are meant to bring them together, to complete the pattern. But to what end? Thornbury asked, though her question seemed rhetorical, directed more to the universe than to her companions. What happens when the pattern is complete? The humming had grown perceptibly louder, and now Watson noticed something else. The brick wall at the alley's end was not entirely solid. There was a darkness within it, a vertical line that suggested a gap, a doorway that had been invisible from a distance, but which resolved itself as they approached into a narrow passage barely wide enough for a single person to pass. Holmes moved forward, shining his electric torch into the opening. The beam revealed stone steps descending into darkness, old stone worn smooth by countless feet over uncounted years. The humming emanated from below, growing stronger as Holmes directed the light downward, revealing perhaps a dozen steps before the passage curved out of sight. Shadwell Court, Holmes said softly, is not a court at all in the conventional sense. It is an entrance, a threshold, and unless I am very much mistaken, those steps lead to chambers that existed here long before Whitechapel was built, perhaps even before London itself rose on these banks. We stand at the doorway to something ancient, something that has waited with enormous patience for precisely this moment, this night, this particular alignment of circumstances and people. He turned to face the group, his expression grave in the torchlight. This is your final opportunity to withdraw. What lies below may provide answers, but I cannot guarantee what form those answers will take, nor what risks we may face in seeking them. I am proceeding because my nature demands I pursue mysteries to their conclusion, whatever that conclusion may be. But each of you must decide for yourselves whether curiosity outweighs caution, whether knowledge is worth potential danger. The six of them stood at the threshold, the humming of unseen forces rising around them, the darkness below offering no promise except uncertainty. Watson found his hand moving unconsciously to the revolver in his coat, that solid weight of metal and wood providing a comforting illusion of control in a situation that seemed increasingly beyond any conventional means of management. It was MacDonald who moved first, stepping forward to stand beside Holmes at the top of the stairs. I did not travel from Edinburgh to turn back at the very moment of revelation, she said firmly. Whatever lies below, I will face it. One by one, the others joined her, forming a small cluster at the threshold, united by shared determination and that peculiar courage, born not of fearlessness, but of the decision that some questions are worth facing one's fears to answer. Part 6. Holmes descended first, his torch cutting a pale beam through darkness that seemed to possess unusual density, as though the shadows themselves resisted illumination. Watson followed immediately after, his medical training asserting itself in the careful attention he paid to the worn stone steps, noting their irregular depth and the moisture that made them treacherous. Behind them came the others in single file, each person's breathing audible in the confined space, each footfall echoing softly against stone walls that pressed close on either side. The stairs curved gently leftward as they descended, following what Watson estimated to be a spiral pattern, though the turns were so gradual that the overall trajectory remained unclear. The humming grew steadily stronger, joined now by other sounds. a faint rushing like distant water, a periodic clicking that might have been mechanical or organic, and beneath everything, a deep thrumming pulse that Watson felt in his chest as much as heard with his ears. The air grew warmer as they progressed downward, carrying scents of old stone and earth, along with something sweet and slightly acrid that he could not immediately identify. After perhaps 50 steps, the stairway opened into a corridor, its ceiling lost in darkness above, but its walls visible in the torchlight as dressed stone blocks fitted together with the precision of master craftsmen. The floor was smooth flagstone, and along the walls at regular intervals stood niches that might once have held lamps or statuary, though they now stood empty, save for dust and cobwebs that suggested long abandonment. "Remarkable," Blackwood murmured, running his hand along the wall's surface. "This stonework is medieval at the latest, possibly much older, and the construction technique suggests builders who understood forces and stresses with sophistication equal to any modern engineer. This is no crude cellar or forgotten foundation. This was built with purpose and maintained with care, at least at one time." The corridor extended ahead into darkness, and Holmes proceeded with methodical caution, his torch sweeping back and forth to illuminate both the path ahead and the walls on either side. They passed several branching passages, but Holmes kept to the main corridor, following what appeared to be his inner compass, combined with the growing strength of the humming sound that now clearly emanated from somewhere ahead. Thornbury had moved up beside Watson, and he heard her breathing quicken as they progressed. "I have seen this place," she whispered. "In the dreams, I walked this corridor. There are chambers off to the sides, filled with things I could not quite perceive. And ahead, at the end, is the circular room where the figures wait." As if in confirmation of her words, the corridor widened gradually, and Watson began to perceive a change in the quality of the darkness ahead. It was not merely the absence of light, but something more active, a luminescence that existed in shades the eye struggled to process. The humming had reached a pitch that vibrated in his bones, setting his teeth on edge. Yet it was not unpleasant, so much as simply overwhelming, a sensation that pushed at the boundaries of normal perception. The corridor ended in an archway, beyond which lay the circular chamber they had seen in mirror and photograph and dream. Holmes paused at the threshold, his torch now nearly superfluous, as the chamber itself provided illumination from sources Watson could not immediately identify. He stepped through the archway, and Watson followed, emerging into a space that defied his expectations, even as it confirmed every description they had been given. The chamber was perhaps 40 feet in diameter, its walls rising to a domed ceiling that seemed impossibly high, given the depth they had descended. The walls were carved with intricate patterns that moved and shifted in the uncertain light, symbols and scripts and images that flowed from one to another like water, never quite resolving into forms the mind could fully grasp. The floor was polished stone inlaid with complex geometric patterns, and at its exact centre stood the table MacDonald had described. But it was the light that captured Watson's attention most completely. It came from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, existing in colours that should not be possible, blues that verged on ultraviolet, greens that seemed to pulse with organic life, purples so deep they bordered on blackness yet somehow remained luminous. The illumination cast no shadows, or perhaps cast only shadows, creating an environment where depth and distance became uncertain. where the eye could not quite determine where walls ended and ceiling began. Around the chamber's perimeter stood 12 figures in robes of dark fabric that might have been medieval in cut, or might simply have been timeless in their simplicity. Their hoods were drawn forward, concealing faces completely, and they stood with such perfect stillness that Watson's first thought was that they must be statues or mannequins, some elaborate theatrical staging meant to recreate the medieval society's ceremonies. Then one of them moved, a slight turning of the head, and Watson's hand went instinctively to his revolver, though he did not draw it. The figure raised one arm slowly, the gesture one of welcome rather than threat, and from within the hood came a voice that seemed to emanate from the air itself, rather than from any individual throat. "Welcome, seekers. Welcome to the threshold. You have journeyed far, across miles and years, and the boundaries between possible and impossible, to stand in this place at this moment. Welcome, and know that you come by invitation, by selection, by the alignment of countless subtle forces that have prepared this meeting across the span of time itself." The voice was neither male nor female, neither old nor young, but rather carried qualities of all these and none, as though multiple speakers were speaking in perfect synchronization, or as though a single speaker existed somehow outside the normal constraints of human vocalization. Watson found himself listening, not just with his ears, but with some deeper faculty, perceiving layers of meaning beneath the words, harmonics and overtones that conveyed information beyond mere language. Holmes had moved forward to stand before the central table, his entire being focused on cataloguing and analysing what he observed. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. Or perhaps more accurately, what are you? The Custodes Umbrarum disbanded 5 centuries ago, their members scattered or imprisoned. Yet here you stand, or appear to stand, in a chamber that seems to exist outside normal time and space. Are you ghosts, echoes of the past, or something else entirely? "We are scholars," came the reply, and this time Watson noticed that while one figure's hood had turned toward them, the voice still seemed to come from everywhere at once. "As you are scholars, we are seekers of knowledge, pursuers of understanding, those who stand at the boundaries between what is known and what is hidden. We have always been, in one form or another, and we shall always be. The society you call Custodes Umbrarum was merely one expression of an impulse that transcends any single age or culture. The impulse to question, to explore, to push beyond the comfortable limitations of conventional wisdom." MacDonald had moved to stand beside Holmes, her silver mirror held before her, and Watson noticed that its surface now showed not the chamber they stood within, but something else. Shifting images of other times, other places, other gatherings of robed figures in chambers that might have been this one, or might have been scattered across centuries and continents. "You exist in multiple times simultaneously," she said, her voice filled with wonder rather than fear. "You are not bound to this moment, but move through time as we move through space. That is how you could contact us, how you could leave objects in our present from your past, or perhaps from our future. You exist at the threshold, in the liminal space between moments. You begin to understand," the voice confirmed, and Watson thought he detected something like approval in its tone. "Time is not the rigid sequence you experience in your daily lives. It is fluid, flexible, a river with many channels and currents. Most humans experience only one narrow stream, flowing always forward, never perceiving the greater pattern. But there are moments, places, configurations of circumstance when the boundaries become permeable. The winter solstice, the turning of the year, midnight on Christmas Eve. These are not mere human conventions, but actual thin places in time's fabric. Moments when those with knowledge and will might perceive and even traverse the boundaries between then and now, and yet to come. Ashford had pulled out his notebook and was scribbling furiously, his scientific training apparently overcoming any shock or fear. This aligns with certain theoretical frameworks, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. If time is indeed relative rather than absolute, if consciousness plays a role in observation and therefore in reality itself, then what you describe is not impossible, merely improbable according to our current limited understanding. Blackwood had approached the table, drawn by the objects displayed upon it. Up close, Watson could see them more clearly. The book was bound in leather, so old it had turned nearly black, its pages covered in scripts that shifted between languages as one watched. Latin giving way to Greek, then to Arabic, then to characters Watson did not recognize at all, before cycling back through the sequence. The glass vessel pulsed with its impossible liquid, which formed shapes and patterns as it climbed the container's sides. Faces, symbols, landscapes, each lasting only moments before dissolving into the next. And arranged in their precise triangular formation were 3 empty spaces, clearly waiting. "You want us to place the objects here," Thornbury said, her hand moving to the pocket where she kept the photograph. "The stone, the photograph, the mirror. That is why you gave them to us, why you drew us to this place. They are keys, or perhaps components of some mechanism. But what will happen when they are brought together?" The robed figures remained motionless, but the voice continued, patient and inexorable as tide. "They are markers, anchors, connections between specific moments in time. Each object carries within it a crystallized instant, a frozen point of temporal significance. When brought together in this place, at this moment, they will create a bridge, a pathway that allows passage across the boundaries we have described. They will allow you to witness what lies beyond the threshold, to see what we have seen, to know what we have learned across centuries of study and observation." "And what lies beyond?" Holmes asked, his tone sharp, despite the dreamlike quality the chamber imposed. "What is it you wish us to witness or experience? What purpose does this elaborate construction serve?" For the first time, multiple figures moved simultaneously, turning their hooded faces toward Holmes in unison. When the voice came again, it carried a weight of significance that made Watson's breath catch. "Beyond the threshold lies choice, Mr. Holmes. You have been selected because each of you stands at a crossroads in your own timeline, a moment when the decisions you make will ripple forward through years and decades, affecting not only your own lives, but the lives of countless others. We offer you the chance to see those ripples, to perceive the consequences of choices not yet made, to understand the patterns your actions will create in time's fabric." Sven. The silence that followed this pronouncement seemed to expand, filling the chamber with a weight that pressed upon mind and body alike. Watson found his thoughts turning inward, examining the notion that his life stood at some crucial juncture, though he could not immediately identify what choices loomed with such significance. Beside him, he sensed similar introspection overtaking his companions, each person suddenly confronted with the suggestion that their presence here transcended mere scholarly curiosity or mystical coincidence. Holmes broke the stillness, his voice carrying that peculiar blend of skepticism and fascination that characterized his approach to the inexplicable. You speak of seeing consequences before choices are made, of perceiving futures that have not yet occurred. But if the future can be known, does that not eliminate the very concept of choice? If all outcomes are already written in time's fabric, as you call it, then free will becomes illusion, and your offer of knowledge is merely the revelation of an already determined script. The robed figures shifted slightly, a rustling of fabric that might have been the collective intake of breath, though whether in surprise at being challenged or appreciation of the question's astuteness, Watson could not determine. The voice, when it came, held a new quality, something almost like warmth threading through its otherworldly timbre. An excellent objection, and one that has occupied our studies for centuries. The answer, insofar as we have discovered one, is that time possesses qualities both fixed and mutable. There are, if you will, streams that flow with great force towards certain destinations, currents so strong that deviation becomes nearly impossible. These are the great patterns, the structural elements of history and causation. But within and around these major currents flow countless smaller eddies and tributaries, moments of genuine choice, where the flow might be directed one way or another, where individual will can alter the pattern if only slightly. Thornbury had moved closer to the table, her fingers hovering over the empty space that seemed to call for the photograph she carried. You are saying that while the broad strokes of the future may be determined, the details remain open to influence, that our choices matter even within a larger framework we cannot fully control. Precisely, and more than this, we suggest that consciousness itself, the act of observation and intention, plays a role in collapsing possibilities into actualities. Your medieval predecessors in the custards understood this intuitively, though they lacked the language to express it clearly. Your modern physicists are beginning to approach the same understanding through mathematics and experimentation. We, who exist partially outside the normal flow of time, have observed it directly. Reality is not fixed until observed, and even then, other possibilities continue to exist in adjacent streams, accessible to those who know how to perceive them. Ashford looked up from his notes, his young face alight with intellectual excitement that temporarily overrode any fear or caution. You are describing something like the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, but applied to macroscopic reality, to human choice and historical causation. Each decision point creating branching timelines, multiple realities existing simultaneously. Your science progresses toward truth, though it has far to go. But yes, Dr. Ashford, you grasp the essential concept, and what we offer tonight is the chance to perceive those branches before you commit to walking one particular path, to see, briefly and imperfectly, what lies down roads not yet chosen. MacDonald had been very quiet, her hand still clutching the silver mirror, her expression contemplative. When she spoke, her voice carried the soft burr of her native Highlands more strongly, as though the strangeness of their circumstances had stripped away layers of academic polish to reveal something older beneath. In the Celtic traditions I study, there are tales of travellers who meet beings at crossroads, who are offered knowledge or gifts or warnings. These encounters always come at a price, though the price is not always clear at the moment of acceptance. What price do you ask for this knowledge you offer? For I have studied enough old stories to know that nothing of such significance comes freely. The chamber seemed to pulse with that strange, sourceless light, and the humming that had been a constant background presence suddenly swelled and then dropped to near silence, as though the space itself were considering the question. When the voice returned, it carried a new gravity, an acknowledgement that they had reached the heart of the matter. The price is change itself. To perceive the patterns we would show you is to become unable to unknow them. You cannot see the consequences of your choices, and then proceed as though you had not seen. Knowledge transforms the knower, always and inevitably. You will leave this chamber different than you entered, carrying awareness that will shape every decision you make henceforth. Some would consider this gift. Others might name it burden. We offer it as both, inseparable and complete. Watson felt Holmes tense beside him, and he understood his friend's hesitation. Holmes's methods depended upon observation and deduction, upon accumulating facts and reasoning toward truth. But this offer was something else entirely. Not earned knowledge, but granted vision. Not the satisfaction of puzzle solving, but the revelation of answers before questions were fully formed. "There is more," Holmes said quietly, his detective's instincts clearly warning him of complications not yet voiced. "You have gone to considerable effort to bring us here, to this specific time and place. You speak of our choices having significance, but I suspect you perceive patterns we do not, see consequences that extend beyond our individual lives. What do you see in our futures that makes our presence here worth such elaborate preparation?" The 12 figures moved then, stepping forward in perfect unison, closing the circle around the central table where the 6 visitors stood. They were not threatening in their approach, yet Watson felt his heart rate quicken, his hand once more seeking the reassuring weight of his revolver. The figures stopped perhaps 10 feet from the table, forming a living barrier between the chamber's entrance and its centre, and the voice, when it spoke, seemed to come now from all 12 simultaneously, a chorus rather than a single speaker. "We see a century unfolding, Dr. Watson. You who stand with hand upon weapon, ready to defend against threats you cannot fully perceive. We see a century of wonders and horrors, of achievements that will astonish and atrocities that will appall. We see wars that will span the globe, weapons that will harness the very power of atoms, machines that will think and dream and perhaps even possess consciousness. We see humanity reaching toward heights previously unimaginable, while simultaneously courting depths of destruction that threaten extinction itself." The voice paused, and into the silence rushed the implications of such vision, such foreknowledge of coming darkness and light. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, a cold that emanated from contemplating the scope of what was being described. "And we see 6 individuals," the voice continued, softer now, almost intimate despite its otherworldly quality. 6 people who stand at this threshold on Christmas Eve in 1891, each of whom will make choices in the coming years that contribute, in ways large and small, to shaping how that century unfolds. A detective whose methods will influence generations of those who seek truth through reason. A physician whose writings will inspire thousands to value both scientific rigor and human compassion. Scholars whose work will preserve and illuminate knowledge that might otherwise be lost. a physicist whose early insights will contribute to understandings that transform civilization, and all of you, in your various ways, will touch lives, influence students, make decisions whose consequences ripple forward through time, in patterns we have observed, but which remain, even now, not entirely fixed. Blackwood had pulled the ancient stone from his pocket, holding it in his palm where it seemed to gather the chamber's strange light, pulsing in rhythm with the deep thrumming that underlay all other sounds. You see us as, what? Important figures in history? That seems rather grandiose for a handful of scholars and one consulting detective. Not important in the sense of fame or public recognition, Professor Blackwood. Most of your names will never appear in history texts, never be celebrated in public monuments. But importance is not measured only in public acclaim. A teacher who inspires one student who goes on to change the world, is that teacher not important? A friend who offers counsel at a crucial moment, does that friendship not matter? A choice to pursue knowledge rather than comfort, to value truth over convenience, to maintain integrity in small daily decisions. Do these not shape the world as surely as any political or military action? Thornbury had withdrawn the photograph from her pocket, and Watson observed that the shadowy figure visible in its background had become clearer, more defined, as though proximity to this place had enhanced the image's quality. You are telling us that ordinary choices matter, she said slowly, that the small decisions we make in our daily lives accumulate into forces that shape centuries, that we need not be kings or generals to influence the course of history. Yes, and more, we are telling you that this moment, this Christmas Eve, this threshold in time, is such a decision point for each of you. Before you lie paths that diverge in ways subtle but significant. We offer the chance to perceive those divergences, to see fragments of what may come, so that when you choose with eyes at least partially open. MacDonald raised her mirror, its surface now swirling with images too rapid to clearly perceive. Faces and places and moments flickering past like pages rifled in a book. And if we decline, if we leave this chamber now, return to the surface world without placing our objects on the table, without accepting your offer, then you leave unchanged, carrying only the memory of this night, which will fade gradually into uncertainty, becoming over time no more than a curious dream, a shared delusion you will eventually question and dismiss. The objects you carry will lose their peculiar qualities, becoming merely old stone, ordinary photograph, simple mirror. You will return to your lives and make your choices blindly, as most humans do, guided by partial information and immediate concerns, rather than by perception of larger patterns. There is no shame in this choice. It is how nearly all lives are lived. Holmes had been circling the table slowly, examining it from all angles, his analytical mind clearly working through every aspect of what they had been told, testing for inconsistencies or deceptions. Watson knew that look, had seen it countless times when his friend approached the climax of an investigation, weighing evidence and probabilities with that remarkable intellect that had solved so many seemingly impossible cases. And yet, Holmes said finally, stopping his circuit to face the assembled robed figures, I suspect there is an element you have not mentioned. You speak of offering knowledge, of allowing us to perceive patterns and consequences, but knowledge alone does not explain the elaborate nature of this construction, the medieval vellum and impossible objects, the dreams and summons across time itself, You want something from us, not merely to give us something. What is it you hope we will do with the knowledge you offer? The chamber pulsed with light, and for a moment Watson thought he saw through the robed figures, saw them as translucent, insubstantial, as though they were indeed echoes or projections, rather than physical beings. Then the moment passed, and they seemed solid once more, but the impression remained, unsettling and profound. You perceive correctly, Mr. Holmes. We are not merely benevolent spirits offering wisdom from pure altruism. We are, as we said, scholars, and scholars always have purposes in their research, goals that extend beyond simple curiosity. What we hope, and it is hope, not certainty, for even we cannot fully predict what you will choose, is that by showing you the patterns we have observed, you might be moved to make choices that strengthen certain tributaries of time's flow, that encourage paths toward outcomes we believe beneficial for your species and your world. Part 8. Watson felt the implications of this admission settle over the chamber like falling snow, each word adding weight to what had already become an almost unbearably significant moment. They were not merely being offered knowledge then, but being recruited, drawn into some vast pattern whose full scope remained hidden even as fragments were revealed. The detective in Holmes would surely balk at manipulation, however benevolent its intention. Yet Watson also sensed in his friend that deep curiosity that could override caution when confronted with genuine mystery. "You seek to influence the future," Holmes said, his voice carefully neutral, "by influencing us, to shape coming events through the choices we make after witnessing what you show us. That is rather more than simply offering knowledge, is it not? That is orchestration, perhaps even manipulation, dressed in the garments of illumination. Is a teacher who shows a student the consequences of ignorance manipulating that student? Is a physician who describes the effects of unhealthy habits orchestrating a patient's life? We offer perspective, Mr. Holmes. What you do with that perspective remains entirely within your control. We cannot force your choices, cannot compel your actions. We can only reveal patterns and hope that wisdom follows revelation." Ashford had moved to stand beside Holmes, his notebook forgotten now, his entire being focused on the philosophical and practical implications of what they were discussing. But if you exist outside normal time, if you can perceive future outcomes, then you must already know whether we will accept your offer, what we will see, how we will respond. From your perspective, this conversation has already occurred, is occurring, and will occur simultaneously. So why the pretense of choice? The voice, when it responded, carried something that might have been approval or might have been amusement, though the otherworldly quality made such distinctions difficult. "Dr. Ashford, you have identified one of the central paradoxes of temporal consciousness. Yes, from certain perspectives, all moments exist simultaneously. All choices are already made, all outcomes already determined. Yet, from within the flow of time, from the perspective you currently occupy, choice feels real, decisions matter, the future remains unwritten. Both perspectives are true, depending on one's position relative to time's structure. We exist at a threshold between these perspectives, able to perceive both the fixity and the fluidity of temporal reality." MacDonald had been very still during this exchange, but now she stirred, her hand tightening on the silver mirror. In the old stories, the Celtic tales of threshold places and liminal beings, those who accepted supernatural knowledge often paid prices they did not anticipate. suffered consequences they could not foresee. You speak honestly of transformation, of change that cannot be undone. But are there other costs we should understand before we proceed? The robed figures drew slightly closer, and Watson noticed for the first time that their feet made no sound against the stone floor, left no impression in the thin layer of dust that centuries should have accumulated. They were less substantial than they appeared, or perhaps more substantial in dimensions the eye could not properly perceive, existing in this chamber only partially, the rest of their being extended into realms or times beyond immediate perception. "The cost is isolation," came the reply, and for the first time the voice carried what Watson recognized as genuine emotion. Not quite sadness, but something adjacent to it, an acknowledgement of inevitable loneliness. Those who see patterns others cannot perceive, who understand connections invisible to normal awareness, find themselves separated from common experience in ways both subtle and profound. You will know things you cannot easily explain, perceive relationships others miss, see significance in events that seem ordinary to those around you. This knowledge will set you apart, create a distance between your understanding and the understanding of those who have not stood at this threshold. Some will think you prescient, others will consider you strange, and you yourselves may sometimes doubt what you have witnessed, question whether memory or madness guides your perceptions. Thornbury drew a deep breath, her hand moving finely to place the photograph upon the table, setting it carefully in the space that seemed to call for it. The moment the photograph touched the table's surface, the chamber responded. The humming intensified, rising in pitch and complexity, and the strange light grew brighter, colours shifting towards spectrums. Watson's eyes struggled to process. The photograph itself began to glow softly, the shadowy figure in its background becoming clearer, more defined, resolving into a robed form identical to those surrounding them. "I have spent my life studying hidden knowledge," Thornbury said quietly, her hand still resting on the photograph as though reluctant to break contact, pursuing understanding of secret societies and lost wisdom. If this threshold offers genuine insight into patterns that shape our world, I cannot turn away from it, whatever the cost. The price of isolation seems small compared to the price of ignorance. Blackwood hesitated only a moment longer before placing his stone beside the photograph. It settled into position with a soft click, as though finding a groove prepared specifically for its shape, and immediately began to pulse with that strange inner light, its dark surface becoming translucent, revealing layers and depths that should not exist within simple stone. The humming shifted again, incorporating new harmonics, and Watson felt the vibration now not just in his chest, but throughout his entire body, as though he were becoming part of some vast instrument being tuned to an unknown frequency. "Knowledge has always required courage," Blackwood said, echoing Thornbury's sentiment. The Custodes Umbrarum understood this when they pursued their studies, despite persecution and eventual dissolution. If we, who stand centuries later with the advantage of all that has been learned since their time, cannot match their courage, what does that say about our commitment to truth? All eyes turned to MacDonald, who still held her mirror, her expression troubled but determined. She looked into its surface one final time, and Watson, standing close enough to see its reflection, glimpsed something that made his breath catch. A vision of 6 figures standing around a table in a circular chamber. But the perspective was from above and outside. as though the mirror showed not their current position, but how they appeared from some external vantage point. And surrounding the chamber, pressing close against invisible barriers, were other forms, other presences, watching with what might have been hunger or hope, or simply intense attention. "We are observed," MacDonald said softly, addressing not the robed figures, but her companions. "This chamber exists at an intersection, a crossing point, where many times and places converge. What we do here resonates beyond this moment, touches other times and other seekers who stand at similar thresholds. We are not alone in this choice, though we make it individually." She placed the mirror on the table, completing the triangle of objects, and the chamber's response was immediate and overwhelming. The three artifacts, stone, photograph, mirror, began to resonate together, their individual lights merging and intensifying, creating a column of luminescence that rose from the table's surface toward the distant ceiling. The column was not merely light, but seemed to possess texture and depth, to contain within itself images and possibilities, moments and memories, all layered together in a tapestry too complex for the eye to fully untangle. The humming had become almost musical now, a chord composed of tones that existed both above and below the range of normal hearing, felt as much as heard, causing the very stones of the chamber to vibrate in sympathy. The robed figures had stepped back, creating more space around the table. And through their circle, Watson could see the archway through which they had entered. But it appeared distant now, diminished, as though the chamber had expanded, or they had somehow moved to its very centre, despite standing in the same position. Holmes had taken Watson's arm, his grip firm but not painful, an anchor to shared reality in a moment when reality itself seemed to be dissolving and reforming around them. "Whatever happens now," Holmes said quietly, his voice nearly lost in the chamber's resonance, "remember that we chose this freely, with full knowledge of its strangeness and uncertainty. Hold to that choice, Watson. Let it steady you through what comes next." The robed figures raised their arms in unison, sleeves falling back to reveal hands that were simultaneously substantial and translucent, present and absent, as though they flickered between states of existence too rapidly for the eye to track. They spoke together now, their voices merging with the chamber's humming, creating words that Watson heard both with his ears and directly in his mind, bypassing the normal channels of sound and perception. The threshold opens, the pattern completes, the bridge extends across time's river, connecting this moment to moments past and moments yet to come. Look into the light, seekers. Look and see the patterns we have perceived, the consequences that flow from choices made and unmade, the vast web of causation that links all actions across the span of years and centuries. Look and understand what it means to stand at the crossroads of time itself. The column of light blazed brighter, and Watson found his eyes drawn to it, despite an instinctive desire to look away, to shield himself from its intensity. Within the light, images began to form, not sequential like photographs in an album, but layered and simultaneous, presenting multiple scenes at once in a way that should have been incomprehensible, yet somehow remained coherent to his perceiving mind. He saw himself, older, grey-haired, sitting in a familiar room, writing with steady hand, despite the years that had accumulated in his face's lines and his body's stoop. The room around him was filled with papers and photographs, memories accumulated over decades, and on the desk before him lay a manuscript whose title he could just barely perceive. The final problem. The title sent a chill through him, though he did not understand why, only that it carried weight and sorrow, and a sense of ending that felt premature, incomplete. The image shifted without quite changing. The same room, but different contents. Different papers scattered across different surfaces. Now the title visible was The Empty House, and the Watson in the vision looked older still, but there was something in his face that suggested relief mixed with lingering grief. A man who had recovered something precious he thought forever lost. More images cascaded through the light, too many and too rapid to fully catalogue. Himself in various situations, across years and decades, always writing, always recording, the companion and chronicler to Holmes's deductions. He saw cases solved and unsolved, dangers faced and survived. The long friendship that had defined so much of his life extending forward through time like a golden thread woven through the fabric of coming years. But there were choice points too, moments when the thread might have been cut or diverged onto different paths. He saw himself standing at other thresholds, literal and metaphorical, doorways he might walk through or turn away from, words he might speak or leave unspoken, actions he might take or avoid. And branching from each decision were consequences, effects rippling forward through time, influencing not just his own life, but the lives of those around him, students who would read his accounts and be inspired toward their own pursuits of truth and justice, readers who would find in his tales some comfort or courage or simply entertainment that brightened otherwise difficult days. Part 9. The visions expanded outward from Watson's personal thread to encompass the others, their lives and choices, interweaving in patterns of astonishing complexity. He saw Holmes at various ages, the sharp features growing leaner and more austere with time, the grey eyes retaining their intensity, even as the face around them showed accumulating years. There were scenes of triumph and near disaster, moments of brilliant deduction, and instances of dangerous miscalculation. And through it all, the restless, burning need to solve puzzles, to impose order on chaos, to find truth hidden beneath layers of deception. But there was darkness too, shadows that gathered around certain points in Holmes's timeline, like storm clouds accumulating before thunder. Watson saw his friend in moments of profound isolation, standing at windows gazing at nothing. The loneliness of exceptional intellect creating chasms between Holmes and the common run of humanity. He saw the temptation of chemicals that promised respite from boredom, the dangerous cases that flirted too closely with mortality, and one image in particular that struck Watson with physical force. Holmes falling, tumbling through space, locked in deadly embrace with another figure, both men suspended above a roaring torrent of water, a moment frozen between life and death, where choice and chance intersected with terrible finality. Yet even as this image threatened to overwhelm him with its suggestion of tragedy, it shifted, revealing other possibilities. Holmes emerging from shadows years later, aged but alive, having chosen survival over the theatrical gesture of mutual destruction. Holmes in peaceful retirement, keeping bees and contemplating the patterns of nature rather than crime. Multiple futures branching from that single terrible moment at the precipice, some ending in death, others leading to continued life and work. And Watson understood suddenly that what they were seeing was not prophecy, but possibility, not fate, but the range of outcomes that choice and circumstance might produce. Thornbury's life unfolded in parallel streams of academic achievement and personal fulfillment, her scholarship touching countless students across decades of teaching and writing. Watson saw her in lecture halls, libraries, conferences, always pursuing knowledge with the dedication she had demonstrated tonight. But there were choice points here too, moments when personal desires conflicted with professional ambitions, when love might be pursued or set aside for scholarship's sake, when health might be preserved through rest or sacrificed to deadline-driven completion of important work. Each choice opened different paths, each path leading to outcomes both beautiful and melancholy in their various ways. Blackwood's future revealed a man wrestling with the tension between revelation and rationality, trying to reconcile what he had witnessed in this chamber with the empirical methods his field demanded. Watson saw him writing papers that danced around direct acknowledgement of tonight's events, embedding insights gained from temporal vision within conventional academic frameworks, influencing other scholars through indirect suggestion rather than explicit declaration. There was isolation here, as the robed figures had warned, the loneliness of knowing things that could not be spoken, but there was also satisfaction in the gradual influence his work exercised, seeds planted that would flower in others' minds across generations. MacDonald's timeline branched most dramatically, multiple possible futures diverging sharply from this threshold moment. In some, she returned to Edinburgh and pursued conventional academic career, publishing respected but ultimately limited work, her potential constrained by the caution that sometimes followed profound, unsettling experiences. In others, she embraced the strangeness of what she had witnessed, allowing it to inform research that pushed boundaries and challenged assumptions, producing scholarship that was controversial but ultimately transformative in its field. The price of the second path was greater, more isolation, more doubt, more professional risk, but the rewards extended far beyond personal satisfaction, touching students and readers who would find in her work permission to pursue their own unconventional insights. Ashford's visions were perhaps the most startling, for they showed a young man whose early career in physics would lead him toward discoveries and applications that would reshape civilization. Watson saw laboratories and equations, experiments that probed the nature of matter and energy at scales both infinitesimally small and cosmically vast. He saw Ashford contributing to understandings that would eventually lead to technologies of immense power, developments that could liberate humanity or destroy it, depending on how they were applied and controlled. And he saw the terrible burden of such knowledge, the responsibility of understanding forces that could be used for healing or for harm, the eternal question of whether knowledge should be pursued, even when its applications might prove catastrophic. The visions began to accelerate, moving beyond individual lives to show larger patterns, historical currents into which their personal choices would flow. Watson glimpsed wars of unprecedented scale and horror, mechanized slaughter that would make the conflicts of his own century seem almost quaint by comparison. He saw cities in flames, populations displaced, technologies of destruction that defied imagination. But he also saw cooperation and healing, international organizations working to prevent future conflicts, medical advances that would save millions of lives, communications technologies that would connect the world in ways that made the telegraph seem primitive as stone tools. The robed figures' voices wove through the visions, providing context and interpretation, guiding attention towards specific threads in the vast tapestry they were revealing. You see now why your choices matter, why we have drawn you to this threshold. Not because any of you will single-handedly determine history's course, but because each of you will contribute to the currents that shape coming decades and centuries. The detective, whose methods inspire countless others to value rational inquiry and empirical evidence. The physician, whose tales encourage compassion alongside cleverness. The scholars, whose work preserves and illuminates knowledge that might otherwise be lost. The physicist, whose early insights contribute to understandings both wondrous and terrible. The light was beginning to dim now, the visions fading like dreams upon waking, becoming harder to hold in conscious memory, even as their emotional impact remained. Watson felt tears on his face, though he could not recall when he had begun weeping, his heart overwhelmed by the scope of what he had witnessed, the terrible beauty of seeing so many lives and choices and consequences laid bare simultaneously. Holmes stood beside him, pale and shaken but composed, his analytical mind already working to catalogue and preserve as much of the vision as possible, before it dissolved completely into the limitations of normal memory. Thornbury had sunk into a chair that Watson did not recall being present in the chamber, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent emotion. Blackwood leaned heavily against the table, breathing deeply as though he had run a great distance, while MacDonald stood with arms wrapped around herself, her expression one of mingled awe and grief. Ashford had collapsed to his knees, his notebook fallen forgotten beside him, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much too quickly. The robed figures lowered their arms, and with that gesture the light died completely, returning the chamber to its earlier illumination of impossible colours that now seemed almost gentle compared to the blazing intensity of the vision. The three objects on the table, stone, photograph, mirror, lay quiet and ordinary now, their strange luminescence extinguished, appearing as nothing more than curious artifacts whose significance had been exhausted by revelation. "You have seen," the voices said, softer now, almost tender in their acknowledgement of what the vision had cost its witnesses. "You have stood at the threshold and perceived patterns that most humans live and die without glimpsing. You have witnessed the consequences of choices both made and unmade, the vast web of causation that connects all actions across time's span. And now you must return to the world above, to the surface reality of Christmas morning, carrying this knowledge with you into all your remaining days." Holmes found his voice, though it emerged hoarse and strained. "The fall," he said simply, "the moment at the precipice with Moriarty. When does it occur? Can it be prevented, or is it fixed, inevitable?" "You know we cannot answer that, Mr. Holmes. To specify the timing would remove the choice from the moment, would transform possibility into prophecy, and thereby alter the very thing we have shown you. What we can say is this: the moment approaches within years rather than decades, and when it comes, you will have choices even as you fall. Whether those choices lead to death or survival, to ending or transformation, depends on factors we cannot fully predict, because they involve the exercise of will at the very edge of possibility." Watson felt his hand move to his friend's shoulder, gripping firmly, a promise without words that whatever came, whatever that terrible moment might bring, Holmes would not face it alone. He felt Holmes's hand cover his own, returning the pressure, acknowledging the vow. MacDonald had recovered enough to stand, moving toward the robed figures with the directness of one who has moved beyond fear into acceptance. You called this a threshold, and you have shown us what lies beyond it. But thresholds allow passage in both directions. You exist partially outside time's normal flow, observing patterns across centuries. What do you see when you look at yourselves? What choices do beings like you face? And what consequences ripple from your decisions? The chamber seemed to brighten momentarily with what might have been surprise or appreciation. A profound question, Dr. MacDonald, and one we have pondered across our own existence. We too face choices, though they operate on scales difficult to explain in terms comprehensible to those embedded in sequential time. We chose, once, to pursue this mode of existence, to step partially outside the normal flow in order to observe and understand patterns invisible to those within the current. That choice brought knowledge and perspective, but it also brought the isolation we warned you of, magnified 1,000-fold. We exist between belonging fully to no single moment, able to perceive but never to truly participate, to observe but never to experience the immediacy and presence that gives life its savour and significance. Thornbury had risen, moving to join MacDonald before the robed figures. You speak of observation and understanding, but tonight you have done more than observe. You have acted, intervened, brought us here, and shown us visions designed to influence our future choices. That is participation, not mere observation. Why? What do you hope to accomplish beyond the satisfaction of scholarly curiosity? The figures were silent for a long moment, and Watson sensed deliberation, consultation occurring in dimensions or through methods beyond normal perception. When they spoke again, the voice carried a new quality, something that might have been confession or simply honesty, stripped of earlier careful phrasing. We see dangers ahead, crossroads in humanity's development, where choices made in coming decades will determine whether your species survives and flourishes or destroys itself, and much of the world with it. We have observed other times, other civilizations that faced similar thresholds. Some passed through successfully, achieving heights we can barely hint at. Others failed, collapsing into darkness from which they never recovered. We cannot tell you which path your world will take, for that remains genuinely undetermined, balanced on the edge of countless individual choices made by millions of people across coming generations. But we can try to strengthen certain tendencies, encourage certain values, by influencing those whose influence extends beyond their immediate circle. You six, and others we have similarly contacted across decades and centuries, represent our attempt, small, insufficient, but genuine, to tip the balance toward outcomes we believe preferable. Part 10. The confession settled over the chamber like falling snow, beautiful and cold, covering everything with its implications. They were not merely witnesses to some grand temporal pattern, but participants in an effort spanning centuries, recruited by beings whose understanding far exceeded their own, yet who remained, despite their vast perspective, uncertain of outcomes, capable of hope and fear, and the exercise of will toward preferred futures. The revelation was simultaneously humbling and empowering, reducing them to small pieces in an incomprehensible game, while elevating their choices to significance beyond anything they had imagined. Blackwood moved forward, to join his colleagues before the robed figures, and Watson saw in his face the transformation the vision had wrought. The scholar's perpetual questioning, tempered now by direct experience of what he had previously only studied in fragmentary texts. "The Custodes Umbrarum," he said quietly. "The original society in the 15th century. They discovered what you have shown us tonight, didn't they? They found the threshold, perceived the patterns, and it frightened the authorities so profoundly that the society was forcibly disbanded. Not because they practiced heresy or necromancy, but because they had glimpsed truth that challenged the comfortable certainty of sequential time and singular reality. Yes, they were scholars like yourselves, pursuing knowledge wherever it led, and it led them to understandings their age was unprepared to accept. Some were imprisoned, some fled, some recanted under pressure, and spent their remaining years in conventional pursuits, trying to forget what they had witnessed. But a few carried the knowledge forward, passing it in hidden ways to subsequent generations, preserving not the specifics of what they had learned, but the awareness that boundaries exist to be crossed, that reality is vaster and stranger than common perception suggests. You stand in a tradition centuries old, whether you knew it or not, a lineage of those who looked beyond the veil and found there not emptiness, but pattern, not chaos, but profound if disturbing order. Ashford had recovered his notebook, though his hands shook too badly to write with any precision. "The physics," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "The mathematics I've been studying, the theories emerging about time and space and observation, they point toward what you have shown us. Not metaphorically, but literally. Time genuinely is relative, flexible, accessible from positions outside the normal flow. And consciousness plays a role in collapsing possibility into actuality. It's not mysticism at all, merely physics we don't yet fully understand. Your science progresses toward truth, Dr. Ashford, as we said before. In the century to come, your colleagues will develop understandings that approach what we have shown you tonight, though they will express it in mathematics rather than vision, in equations rather than direct perception. But understanding and experiencing are different things, and what you have experienced tonight will inform your work in ways that equations alone could never achieve. You will bring to your physics an awareness of the human implications of temporal flexibility, a consciousness of responsibility that pure mathematical abstraction might otherwise lack. Holmes had been silent during these exchanges, his mind clearly working through everything they had witnessed and heard, constructing frameworks to contain and interpret experiences that resisted conventional analysis. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the measured tone of one who has reached conclusions through careful reasoning, despite the extraordinary nature of the subject matter. You have given us a gift and a burden, as Dr. MacDonald presciently suggested. We cannot unknow what we have seen, cannot return to the comfortable limitations of linear time and singular causation. Every choice we make, henceforth, will carry the weight of having glimpsed its potential consequences. Every action shadowed by awareness of ripples extending far beyond immediate effects. Some might consider this paralyzing, the burden of too much knowledge preventing decisive action. But I suspect you have selected us precisely because you believe we possess the capacity to act despite uncertainty, to make choices informed by, but not determined by foreknowledge, to exercise will even while understanding the vast context within which that will operates. You understand correctly, Mr. Holmes. Paralysis was indeed a risk, and we have seen others overcome by the weight of what we showed them, rendered incapable of choice by too complete awareness of consequences. But we judged you 6 capable of bearing the burden, able to act with wisdom, informed by vision, rather than wisdom paralyzed by it. Time will tell whether our judgment was sound, but we believe, and belief is all even we can have about genuinely undetermined futures, that you will use what you have learned to make choices that strengthen the currents we hope to encourage. The chamber had been gradually growing lighter, or perhaps simply less strange, the impossible colours fading toward shades the eye could more easily comprehend, the humming diminishing to a barely perceptible vibration. The robed figures themselves seemed less substantial now, as though the effort of maintaining presence in this particular time and place was exhausting resources they could not indefinitely sustain. "The threshold closes," they said, and Watson heard in the voice a note of finality, of ending. Christmas Eve gives way to Christmas morning, the liminal moment passes, and the boundaries between times grow solid once more. You must depart now, return to the surface world before the way becomes impassable. Take with you the objects you brought. They have served their purpose as anchors and keys, but they remain yours, reminders of what you have witnessed and the choices that lie ahead. MacDonald retrieved her mirror, Blackwood his stone, Thornbury her photograph, each handling their object with new reverence, aware now of the significance these artifacts carried. The items appeared ordinary once more, their strange luminescence gone, yet Watson sensed they were not truly unchanged, but rather had exhausted some quality or energy in the ritual that had opened the threshold. Batteries drained by the effort of bridging times and revealing patterns. The robed figures gestured toward the archway, and Watson saw that the corridor beyond now glowed with soft golden light, as though dawn had somehow penetrated to these depths, despite the impossibility of direct sunlight reaching so far underground. Go with our blessing and our hope, live well, choose wisely, and know that though you may feel isolated by what you have learned, you are not alone. Others have stood at similar thresholds across the centuries, and others will stand here in times to come. You are part of a lineage of seekers, a tradition of those who pursue understanding despite its costs. That tradition will continue as long as consciousness exists to ask questions, and courage exists to seek answers. Holmes led the way back through the corridor, and Watson followed close behind, aware of the others in file behind him, all 6 moving in silence through passages that seemed shorter now, less labyrinthine, as though the path had simplified, or their perception had sharpened. The stairs appeared ahead sooner than expected, and they climbed toward the surface world, with legs that felt strangely light, as though some burden had been set down, along with the weight of complete ignorance. The narrow opening at the alley's end admitted them back into Whitechapel, just as the first true light of Christmas morning broke across the eastern sky. The rain had ceased entirely during their time below, and the air carried that crystalline clarity that sometimes follows storms, every surface washed clean and gleaming in the pale dawn. London was stirring, early risers emerging to tend fires and prepare festive meals, church bells beginning their calls to Christmas services, the city slowly waking to a day of celebration and rest. The 6 of them stood in the narrow alley, blinking in the growing light, adjusting to the the sudden return to ordinary reality after the strangeness of the chamber below. Watson noticed that the opening through which they had descended was no longer visible, the brick wall appearing solid and unbroken, as though the passage had never existed, or had closed behind them with their departure. He reached out to touch the bricks, feeling only cold stone, no hint of the doorway that had admitted them to mysteries beyond normal comprehension. "Well," Holmes said finally, his voice carrying a lightness that Watson recognized as hard-won composure, masking profound emotion. "That was certainly the most extraordinary Christmas Eve of my considerable experience. I suggest we find breakfast and strong coffee, and then, perhaps, we might discuss how we proceed from here, what we do with what we have learned." They made their way through gradually brightening streets toward a public house Holmes knew that opened early for travellers and night workers, finding warmth and sustenance in simple fare that tasted ambrosial after the intensity of the night's experiences. Over eggs and toast and endless cups of coffee, they began the work of processing what they had witnessed, translating vision into words, comparing impressions, and attempting to construct shared understanding from individual perceptions. The conversation ranged widely, from philosophical speculation about the nature of time to practical questions about how they would live with their new awareness. They made no grand pronouncements, formed no society or pact, but simply acknowledged that they were bound now by shared experience, connected by having stood together at a threshold few would ever approach. As morning turned toward midday, and the public house filled with families celebrating Christmas, the 6 companions prepared to part, each returning to their respective lives and responsibilities, carrying with them the weight and gift of what they had learned. Thornbury and Blackwood would return to Cambridge together. MacDonald would catch an afternoon train back to Edinburgh, and Ashford had family commitments in London that could not be postponed, even for processing temporal visions. Before they separated, MacDonald spoke what all were thinking. "We will meet again, I believe. Not immediately, perhaps, but when circumstances permit and need arises. We are bound now, whether we wish it or not, by having glimpsed patterns others cannot see. That creates obligation as well as opportunity." "Agreed," Holmes said simply. "And should any of you find yourselves in need of consultation, assistance, or simply conversation with someone who understands what we have experienced, Baker Street's door remains open at any hour." They parted with handshakes and quiet farewells, each person carrying their artifact and their memories into whatever futures they would choose, informed now by vision, but not determined by it, aware of consequences, yet not paralyzed by awareness. Holmes and Watson walked slowly back through Christmas morning London, the city bright with holiday cheer, children playing with new toys, adults visiting family and friends, the ordinary beautiful world proceeding in comfortable ignorance of thresholds and temporal patterns and the vast machinery of causation that underlay every moment and choice. "You are quiet, Watson," Holmes observed as they approached Baker Street. "Processing, I imagine, as am I. It will take time to fully integrate what we experienced." "I saw you fall, Holmes," Watson said quietly, the words emerging before conscious decision to speak them. "Locked with Moriarty at a precipice, both of you tumbling toward water far below. I saw it clearly, and it terrified me more than anything else in all those visions. Tell me it can be prevented. Tell me you saw alternative paths." Holmes stopped walking, turning to face his friend fully, his expression gentle, in a way Watson rarely witnessed. "I saw many things, Watson, including that moment you describe. But I also saw survival, saw futures extending decades beyond that fall, saw us old and grey and still pursuing mysteries, with perhaps less energy, but no less enthusiasm. Nothing is fixed, nothing inevitable. That is what they showed us. Not fate, but possibility. Not prophecy, but the range of outcomes that choice and chance might produce. Whatever comes, we will face it together, and the choices we make between now and then will matter. That is both burden and liberation." They resumed walking, and as they climbed the familiar stairs to their sitting room, Watson felt some of the night's tension begin to release, replaced by determination, informed by vision, but not overwhelmed by it. Mrs. Hudson had left cold meats and bread for their return, along with a fire laid ready to light. Simple kindnesses that anchored them to domesticity and comfort. As Christmas Day settled over London, and the two friends sat in companionable silence by the fire, Watson found himself thinking not of the grand patterns and vast consequences they had witnessed, but of smaller things. The friendship that had sustained them through years of cases and dangers. The simple satisfactions of work well done and mysteries honestly pursued. The value of choosing courage over comfort, even when outcomes remained uncertain. He thought of the stories he would write, the cases he would chronicle, and understood now that his role as narrator carried significance beyond mere entertainment or memorial to Holmes's genius. Each account would carry embedded within it values and perspectives shaped by what they had witnessed tonight. Subtle influences that might touch readers in ways neither dramatic nor immediately apparent, but which would accumulate across time into forces that shaped how thousands approached questions of truth and justice and rational inquiry. And understanding this, Watson felt not burden but purpose, not weight but direction, the gift of knowing that choices mattered even when their full consequences remained forever, beyond complete perception. As afternoon deepened toward evening and Christmas Day drew toward its close, Holmes produced his violin, playing quiet melodies that seemed to capture the mood of contemplation and wonder that had settled over them both. And Watson, listening to music that spoke of mysteries both solved and eternal, of patterns glimpsed and forever partially hidden, felt gratitude for the strange gift they had received, the burden they had chosen to bear, the threshold they had crossed together. Before sleep claimed him that night, Watson made a brief entry in his journal, knowing even as he wrote that these words could never fully capture what they had experienced, but needing to make the attempt nonetheless. Christmas Eve, 1891. H and I have stood at a threshold beyond normal comprehension, and glimpsed patterns that will inform all our remaining days. Cannot record details. Some experiences resist translation into words. But this much is certain. Choices matter. Consequences extend far beyond immediate perception, and the work we do, however small it may seem, contributes to currents that shape centuries. Onward then, with eyes more open and hearts more aware. Onward into whatever futures we will help to create. And as he set down his pen and extinguished the lamp, Watson heard from the next room the soft sounds of Holmes preparing for rest, and beyond the windows the quiet breathing of London sleeping. And he understood that the greatest mysteries were not those solved by deduction, but those lived with wisdom, not those explained by reason, but those honoured with courage, not those comprehended completely, but those approached with humility and hope. The threshold had closed, but its effects would ripple forward through all their remaining years, touching lives they would never know, influencing choices they would never witness, contributing to patterns whose full scope they would never completely perceive. And that, Watson thought as sleep finally found him, was exactly as it should be. Thank you for joining us on this journey through mystery and time, dear friend. If you found peace in this tale, if it helped guide you toward restful sleep, I would be grateful if you would leave a like, subscribe to see more stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments below. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest be deep, and may you wake tomorrow refreshed and ready to face whatever thresholds your own life presents. Good night, wherever in the world you may be. Sleep well, and remember that every choice you make sends ripples forward through time, contributing to patterns vast and beautiful, beyond imagining. Good night.